Back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to, for the very first time, explore a specific area of social psychology. But oddly enough, in this lecture, we're not necessarily going to be looking at a specific branch within social psychology, at least one of the more commonly established ones. Instead, what we're going to be looking at is a concept that really overlaps with a lot of other branches of social psychology. It's an area that we call social cognition. And to appreciate its importance, I thought we'd review a couple of the terms that we covered in our last lecture, just to see how important social cognition is in social psychology. So if we look at the definition of social psychology again, something that we covered in our last class, you'll see terms like thoughts, feelings, imagined, highlighted there in red. If we look at other really important topics that we covered in our last lecture, like construals and social influences, you see other terms highlighted in red: perception, comprehension, interpretations, thoughts, emotions. And all these terms have one thing in common. All of them are about internal mental functions, essentially cognitions. And this overlap of these terms across these major concepts within social psychology is not a mistake. Oftentimes, what we see when trying to understand the social world around us is that to predict behavior, to understand things, we also have to understand the mental world happening inside of individuals, essentially their cognitions. And to appreciate how important our cognitions are, I like to cite an analogy that one of my colleagues gave to me a number of years ago. In this analogy, he argued that all of us are essentially looking at the world through very imperfect pictures with lots of gaping holes in them. He argued that even though that world was imperfect, none of us saw it as so. Essentially, all of us, he said, are filling in lots of blanks, putting things together, drawing stuff together in ways that maybe don't even make sense to others, but in doing so, we're creating our own, in our mind, perfect representation of the world around us. And that perfect representation that we create through specific memories pulled, certain things that we focus on, allows us to get a better sense of who we are, what's happening, and figure out how we should react to different things in the world around us. But since all of us are pulling things from different experiences and puzzling things together in different ways, what it means is that we might all encounter the same situation, yet see it in very different ways, and in doing so, react to it in very different ways. In essence, this imperfect picture might give us a better sense as to why social psychologists so often struggle to understand how things work for everybody, because, as we mentioned before with construals, we're all sort of encountering the world in completely different ways at any given moment. This is what social cognitive researchers study. And the thought processes that are occurring inside of our heads to not only piece together the world around us, but then from that, figure out how we're going to navigate within it. And when we talk about these steps that we're taking, another thing that's really critical to discuss in this class is the difference between two types of processes that we're engaging in when we are trying to make sense of the world and react to it. And these two processes are called effortful, or sometimes you'll hear it called controlled processing, and another type of processing called automatic processing. These names are pretty intuitive. Essentially, they give us a very good sense of what we're looking at with both of them. Effortful processing is us pulling together specific memories, trying to understand things, trying to figure out a path forward in, well, as the name implies, effortful way. A great example of this would be if you're sitting here in lecture right now, trying to connect the dots between different disparate topics that we're talking about, maybe material from the readings, and some of the examples that we've given before to get a better understanding of the context behind what we're discussing or what we will be discussing in future topics. Effortful processing is something that really does help us navigate in our world very well. But if we're looking at the one that we use more often, at least most researchers argue we use much more often, it's this other type of processing called automatic processing. One where we're pulling up memories, interpreting things, focusing on things in a way that's not even happening at a conscious level. It's almost happening subconsciously, where we're just thinking on our feet without really deciding how to think. The classic example of automatic processing that people often cite is when we read. Most of us, by the time we get through elementary school, do have the ability and kind of the inability to read pretty much everything at the drop of a hat. If we see a sign, it's almost impossible for us, if it's got letters on it, not to try to string those letters together in some sort of a word. It's just automatic for us. But this automatic processing goes well beyond just reading. Essentially, researchers who study automatic processing argue that we're always trying to interpret the world around us, trying to react to things in ways that we're not even necessarily aware of. They're just such knee-jerk reactions that they happen oftentimes without a lot of thought. And this might lead some of you to argue that maybe this isn't the best thing. But I do want to point out that both effortful and automatic processes have their utility. Looking at where effortful processing, or again, controlled processing, is really valuable, it's in those situations where it is a little unclear as to how we need to respond. Maybe we find ourselves in a novel situation that we've never been in before, or maybe we find ourselves in a moment where making the right decision, understanding things as well as possible, is really critical. While being able to block out other stuff and really take time to digest something is very advantageous at that point. And this is where having those mental functions can be useful. And we're looking at where automatic processing comes into play. What's in all the day-to-day events that we encounter? It takes a lot of energy to engage in effortful processing, and oftentimes we do have to slow things down to do it. Where if we use automatic processing, we can sort of get by the day-to-day that we have. My favorite examples of how valuable automatic processes can be is when we see two individuals having that basic hello conversation that all of us have probably had in our lives. You walk by somebody you know, you say, hey, how's it going? And the other person says, fine, how you doing? And it just happens so smoothly. Well, at least for some of us, it happens pretty smoothly. And you might think, how did that occur? How can you have that quick conversation in a matter of seconds? Well, a lot of it is automatic processing. When somebody asks you, just on the fly, how you're doing, you don't usually sit there and think for a couple minutes about how you're actually doing. You don't assess your last couple days or hours or weeks and then give a detailed report to the individual you're walking by quickly. You just give that knee-jerk reaction of fine or good or whatever your go-to response is when people ask you that question. And then you immediately kick into asking the other person how they're doing without even thinking about it. Those types of things that we engage in that we're going to talk about a little bit later, called scripts, allow us to have these very quick conversations without straining ourselves too much. And it allows us to move on with our day. Imagine if you had to, every time you ran across a friend, sit down and have a 10-15 minute conversation because you just had to think about everything you were going to say. It would be tedious. It would be way too time consuming. And it would also make it very difficult to do other things or attend to other stuff that might be critically important. What it also allows us to do, if we're talking about automatic processing, is it allows us to fill in the blanks when we don't want to put too much effort into fitting in blanks. A great example of this was actually highlighted in a study done way back in 1950 by a researcher named Kelly. In this study, Kelly had two different classes that he told were going to have a guest lecturer come in. In one class, Kelly told the students that this guest lecturer was going to be a little quirky, a little odd, but the person was also very kind-hearted and brilliant. In the other class, Kelly told students that the person that was going to come in was going to be a little bit awkward and weird. You didn't want to cross them because they did have a bit of a temper and they didn't like being questioned. Essentially, Kelly gave them the same information about them being a little unusual, but justified it in different ways. Then the guest lecturer came in to both classes independently, not together, but gave the very scripted lecture on a topic that Kelly and the presenter had designed. Now, this was not something the students were told. It sounded like it was just a random lecture that was coming off the cuff. But as the students listened, they were asked to rate the quality of the presentation, rate how much they learned from it, and give a kind of overarching sense of whether or not they liked the person that was presenting the material. And what Kelly found was that those early introductions to this person, the hints about what they were like, weighed heavily on people's perceptions of this lecturer, this person that was coming in. And this really highlights how this automatic process of us trying to connect things and understand what's going on can help clear up stuff. Now, it is important to note here that Kelly's research sort of highlighted how this can sometimes lead us astray, when a description can take ambiguous behaviors and get us to believe something that maybe isn't accurate. But what Kelly wanted to highlight in this is that oftentimes when we're trying to make sense of stuff, again, we get an incomplete picture, so we do what we can to fill in the blanks. And Kelly and other social psychologists wanted you to probably take something home from this. They probably wouldn't be wanting you to take home the message that we're essentially really bad at judging others because of automatic processes. What they probably want us to understand is that we do these things a lot because the world's filled with ambiguity, and when we do it, we do tend to get a little bit better clarity. And more often than not, we're probably a little bit better off with the clarity that we create. There's always the potential for problems, but having some clarity is better than having no clarity. And that's what sometimes automatic processes can allow us to do. Digest new stuff, make sense of things, without worrying about the peripheral things that we might need to spend a little bit of extra time looking at. So how do these processes work in kind of the cognitive work frame? If we want to define what social cognition is all about, well, social cognition is very multifaceted. It's essentially studying all the different cognitive processes that we utilize when we're in our social environment. This means that social cognitive theorists can look at how we attend to things, how we make sense of the things that we attend to, which things we bring up in our minds to better understand something, and also how we decide to react to those environments after we've brought certain things to mind. Essentially, each step of the way in our reactions to the environment around us can be studied by people studying social cognition. And if we really appreciate all of these different steps, we can recognize how frustrating it sometimes can be to study something in social psychology. Because there are all these different components happening inside of our heads that can lead people encountering the exact same situation to perceive it, to kind of pull up specific memories, to come up with different responses to it in very different ways. So even if there is a lot of weight on the social environment in certain situations, other things tugging at us, going on inside of our head, can lead to very different responses from person to person. But this is what social cognitive psychologists try to tackle: the amazing interaction between our cognitive world and the social world around us. Now we're looking at other concepts that are very closely tied to social cognition. There's another set of terms that I want to mention here. The first big term that I want to cover is this idea of something called a schema. Schemas are concepts that often get tied to our history of psychology and the famous developmental psychologist named Jean Piaget. But schemas are an idea that we're going to revisit numerous times in this class as well. In particular, we're going to talk a lot about this general schema that we call a stereotype, a generalized belief about members of a group simply because they're a part of a group. But there's another type of schema that exists, and it's important to talk about in social cognition, called a script, a generalized understanding of how something will unfold in a specific event. We're looking for an example of a script. Think about how you've kind of learned to behave in a specific classroom. Maybe not this semester, but in previous semesters. You've probably learned how to take turns, or where to sit, or how to direct your attention, or when to show up and what to do. All of that involves a script, kind of a generalized understanding of a sequence of events. And these scripts are everywhere. The classic example of an automatic script that almost all of us have is when we've done a repetitive series of events over and over again, we sort of just go into autopilot and do those things without thinking about it. For those of you that have had jobs for an extended period of time and driven back home almost every single day, or walked back home almost every single day from that job, you might find yourself occasionally just drifting off on those trips home and not even realizing when you got home how you actually got there. And that's really a byproduct of not only us using a script, but us using automatic processes to activate that script and figure out how to navigate home while we're distracting ourselves with other thoughts or other things going on. Stereotypes are also a very important schema that does play a role in our social cognitions, because here we can understand maybe an individual based on their group membership, or even somebody they look like, or something that we've just recently encountered. And in combination, stereotypes and scripts are both types of schemas, and they're both things that leads to a lot of the attention and thoughts and decision-making processes that we've talked about earlier. Tie things together even more, we can talk about another term that's often used in social cognition called accessibility. Essentially, what researchers argue is that when it comes to stereotypes and scripts, in our minds we probably have a ton of them. They're all over the place, but we're not using all of them at any given time. Instead, we're using a select few to understand how to piece together situations and react to those situations. Sometimes when we're talking about accessibility, we have certain scripts or stereotypes that we lean on a lot. We tend to call these things chronically accessible schemas. And the classic example of this is somebody that always sees the world through the lens of politics, where every social interaction, everything that we're trying to read about in the paper, everything that we're trying to discuss goes back to politics in some way, shape, or form. There might also be an individual you know in your life that tends to focus a lot on health, be it mental or physical health, or a combination of the two. And they find a way to think about every situation and every environment kind of in a way that surrounds that idea. Or you might know your social butterflies that think about everything in a social context, getting to meet new people or form new friendships, or think about something involving friendships in almost every single encounter they have. And all of this is a collection of examples of chronically accessible schemas, and many of us have these things that we're carrying with us throughout life that gets us to use certain lenses in every encounter that we have. They're not necessarily bad things, they're just things that are kind of personalized. In fact, some people have linked these chronically accessible schemas to the topic of personality, something we mentioned in our previous lecture. If we're looking at the schemas that are really dependent upon the social situation, there's another type of schema that becomes accessible called a primed schema. One that really comes about not through something that's constantly going on through our head, but something that we've encountered in the environment. And most people argue that many primed schemas are being primed in an automatic way, not an effortful one, not one that we're actually thinking about. And a great example of this, one of my favorite examples of primed schemas, is something that you might have heard of if you've ever thought about getting into med school, called med student syndrome. For those of you who've never heard this term before, it's this weird effect where students, as they're progressing through med school, start to diagnose themselves and others with almost every ailment they're learning about in their classes, even some of the more distant historical ailments that haven't been around for centuries. And it's because they're attuned to specific cues, specific information, that they start to do this. Not because they're trying to diagnose their friends with some random flu that existed hundreds of years ago, but because suddenly a cough in a specific way or some hue to somebody's lips or something like that starts to be perceived differently when you have this extra knowledge that's really in the forefront of your brain. I think this happens all the time. We get these things that push us in different directions, and all of a sudden we're shifted. This happened in a lecturer study, and it happens in numerous ways, even when we think of something really being unrelated to another event gets primed. One of my favorite examples of this is actually one that we can replicate here in class. So if we were in an in-person class, what I would be asking you to do right now is getting into pairs and coming up with sentences for a list of words. Half the class would be asked to come up with sentences for a list of what we call neutral words or random words. And the other half of the class would be asked to come up with sentences for the words that you see listed here: kind, social, breakfast, share, cold, real, and spiritual. I tell every pair that has gotten together that they need to collaborate with each other and come up with just one sentence for the word kind, and just one sentence for the word social, and one sentence for the word breakfast, all the way down so they have a total of 8 sentences when they're done. And then afterward, I ask people to report who did the majority of the work. Was it you or the person you were paired up with? A number of decades ago, by 2 researchers named Sharif, actually not a number of decades ago, about a decade ago, 2 researchers named Sharif and Noor Zion. What they had people do is either come up with sentences for words like you saw here, that what they called spiritual words, or sentences for words that, again, they called neutral. And after they were done with this components to the study, they were told that they were going to be paid for their participation, unbeknownst to them when they signed up for the study, but that the pay was going to be dependent upon how much work people put into the activity. And Zion Sharif essentially suggested to people that there might be some freeloaders and people not doing their share, so they picked one person within the group who they argued to them seemed to be the one that was putting in the lion's share of the work, and that person, they said, was going to get to dictate how much of those $10 that they were given were going to be distributed to them and their partner that they were randomly paired up with. And what Sharif and Noor and Zion found was that the words people were primed with had a pretty heavy impact on how they eventually split the money that they were potentially going to be given. For those that were seeing the spiritual words, the vast majority of them split the money pretty much down the line, to where the partner out of the $10 got around $4.44 on average. When people were given neutral words, ones that didn't involve being nice and sharing and loving and kind and all those wonderful things, they only gave their partners $2.56. Now that means that there were some people that probably split things down the middle, but as an aggregate, there was a dramatic difference between those that were primed with spiritual words and those that weren't. And what this suggests to us is that even though there's lots of other things pulling us in a bunch of different directions like we've been talking about, sometimes priming, even when we don't know what's happening, can push us in directions that we're not even aware of. And this really speaks to not only the power of priming, but the power of automatically primed schemas. And it leads me to another really what I want us to do in this next example is essentially try to test your memory while also trying to prevent your memory from bleeding in to another activity that we're going to do. So I'm going to, in this next slide, show you 5 terms that I want you to try to memorize in just a couple seconds. While you're doing that, know that there's going to be a second activity that we're going to do before I ask you to recall those 5 terms. You'll be able to do it though, I promise. Just try to keep this in your mind and recognize you've got 2 discrete activities that you're going to do. So let's get to the term. Here, 5 terms: adventurous, self-confident, independent, persistent, and strong. Read them 1 or 2 more times. Keep them in your head. I will, I promise, ask you to recall these in a little while. You can do it. Just keep them there. Okay. We're going to have a little bit of a distractor. So I'm going to read to you this story about a gentleman named Donald, and I want you to assess whether or not you agree with Donald's choices after you've been asked to recall the words. Now, this story talks about Donald, a recent college graduate who decided he wanted to rent a yacht and sail it around South America for 2 months after graduating, not while he was at school. We also find out that he realized that money would be tight in both the rental of the yacht and the trips, so he decided to sell a handful of stocks that his parents had invested in for him, and he also sold most of his own possessions. It's a pretty bold move here by Donald. What I'd like you to do, it says 4, but the 5 words that you were asked to remember. Give you a second to do that. If you're writing down the notes, I'll give you even more. And then after doing that, I want you to assess the appropriateness of Donald's decision. Was it good? Was it bad? Was it just kind of odd? My guess is that a number of you might have thought of Donald's behavior as somewhat appropriate. At least not the worst idea in the world. Priming. Well, in the original study that did this, the Donald study, people were given primes like you were, where they saw these positive words and then read a story about Donald that was a little bit more detailed, had a lot more elements to it. Or they were primed with negative words: deceitful, conceited, selfish. Words like that that they were asked to memorize, and also read the same story about Donald, the same detailed story about Donald. And when people were asked to judge the appropriateness of Donald's activities, even though they were told the words that you're memorizing have nothing to do with Donald, don't try to pull them into Donald, people's perspectives of Donald changed dramatically based on the words that they were asked to recall. And this is a really important thing to highlight. In the first activity, when you were reading words and coming up with sentences for them, you were being primed kind of unbeknownst to you. You maybe were a little suspicious since you're sitting in a social psych class, but you didn't know you were being primed. In this second activity, much like the participants in the study, it was very clear that you were being primed. You were seeing words that had a theme to them, but you were also encouraged not to have them impact your perception on Donald. But it's almost impossible to avoid doing that. And this really highlights not only how powerful priming can be, but how oftentimes priming is just this automatic thing that's happening below the surface that pushes us in ways that we're not even remotely aware of. And in classes like this, it leads to just kind of funny effects like we would have found if we were in an in-person class. Incidents. There's actually a number of cases that you've probably heard of over the year where people tap into stereotypes and, unbeknownst to them, react to people differently in a fraction of a second based on the stereotypes that they've accessed in their mind. The most highly controversial and sad case about this is the reaction to many black males or African American males when it comes to crime or just police interactions. One of the first cases to really bring social psychologists' attention to this was a sad case that actually happened a number of years ago to a man named Amadou Diallo. In the Diallo case, he was sitting on a porch, hanging out with a friend one evening, when a number of police officers who were chasing somebody who matched the description of Diallo came running up to Diallo and asked him to get down to the ground. When Diallo reached in to grab his wallet, the police officer started shooting him over a dozen times, even while he was on the ground. And this incident led to national outrage, much like many of the incidents that have perpetuated this same problem over and over again. And it led social psychologists to try to figure out what in the world was going on. Why would something like this happen, and why has it seemed to continually happen in decade after decade in almost the exact same fashion? And one of the champions that really started to examine this from a scientific perspective was a gentleman named Joshua Carell, who ran this really interesting study that he called the shooter effect study, where he asked participants to come in and essentially pretend they were police officers trying to shoot criminals or pulled their gun back in individuals who were presenting things that were not dangerous. So they'd see a clip like the pictures that you see below of a person holding a phone or a gun. And if they saw that person holding a gun, they were supposed to shoot. And if they saw the person holding a phone, they were supposed to not shoot or pull their gun back. And what Carell found repeatedly in his studies, that when black males were on, people had a propensity to shoot the black males, regardless of whether or not they had a gun. And the speed at which they shot the black males, especially the ones with the gun, was significantly faster than white males with a gun or white males without a gun. Now, Carell's research was not necessarily that surprising on the surface, but his follow-ups were really shocking to individuals. What he was able to show in his research was that the race of the people who were engaging in this activity did not matter. Also, he kept finding in the studies that a level of training that people got only had a minimal effect on the biases that people were engaging in this activity. And this in combination, training, race, whether or not people believed these stereotypes about aggression in black males, it was not really that impactful. What was surprising to people, it still to this day is surprising to think of how powerful these automatic processes can be in kind of shaping our knee-jerk reactions to things, even if we don't agree with them. And just to understand kind of the complexity to it and Carell's take on it, I'm going to provide you with a link to a video that's actually primarily, I guess, discussed by Morgan Freeman, or at least Morgan Freeman's the primary spokesperson on it, that really looks at this Carell study and gives us a better sense of what we can conclude from it. And what I'm hoping you're going to understand is that obviously this goes beyond just Carell's study. There's a lot of current events that reflect what Carell found over a decade ago. And it really highlights how automatic processes and priming can sometimes be fine on a situational basis, but it can also lead to tragedies like this that we have to be cognizant of. Many of us to say, if this is the byproduct of automatic processing, this is the byproduct of priming, why don't we just get rid of it? I want you to understand There are situations like this where I think we would love to get rid of it. But in most of our social world, it's just not possible. As we talked about with the conversation example earlier, it would be really tough to interact with our world if we weren't doing a lot of things on sort of autopilot. Having to think about every single thing we're going to say and everything we're going to react to and everything we're going to pay attention to and every decision we're going to make is tedious. It doesn't really have any, I guess, possibility of happening. So we have to sometimes kick into those automatic processes. And what exacerbates the situation is sometimes even when we engage in controlled processes, we're not making that many better decisions. Some studies have even shown that we're almost exactly in the same place when we have time to think about what we're going to do in situations, maybe to kind of grab at stereotypes or scripts and not, versus when we have to react right at the moment. And even if we do have time to think, there's numerous researchers that have shown that we don't even want to think then. Most of us, when we look at Carell's shooter study, tend to argue that we ourselves wouldn't be biased like that. We wouldn't have those reactions that many participants in Carell's study have. And therefore, we don't have to think that much about every move we make, every action we take. But that's faulty thinking. More often than not, we do let stereotypes and scripts dictate a lot of the things that we're using to kind of see the world. And when we rely on them, we don't even recognize that we're doing it. And what's even worse is that when we rely on them, we tend to think that our reliance on our stereotypes and scripts are useful, that they're better than most people's automatic processes. And this relates to something called the overconfidence barrier. My favorite example of this is when students make fun of other students tripping on stuff and running into things while they're trying to text or talk on the phone and walk. They think that everybody else just can't possibly do it because it's just too overwhelming to them, but then they find themselves doing that exact thing and also running into things and tripping on stuff and doing the same embarrassing stuff. There's a challenge for us, even if we want to be more controlled in our thinking, to getting past recognizing how often we are using automatic processes and then getting past this kind of vanity of thinking that our automatic processes are better than those of other individuals. If we can try to address these things and also try to find ways to circumvent automatic processes that are really problematic, well, then there is a chance that we can get past some of the tragedies that we've encountered in the past. And this is where I want to close out class, with a better understanding of what social cognition is about, and also a better understanding of how important understanding this is when understanding our social interactions with the world. Hopefully now you understand that the area of social cognition casts a wide net. It's embedded in a lot of different areas of interest, and what we find within it really has utility in pretty much every topic that we'll be discussing throughout the entire course and throughout many aspects of our lives. If you understand that, very closely related topic. Not necessarily one that's intertwined with social cognition, but another one that tends to bleed into pretty much every area of interest in social psychology, the topic of emotions. And we're going to, in our next class, sort of define the place that emotions have in social psychology research and how social psychologists themselves can study the impact of social environments on emotions. But much like we see here with the social cognitive topic, you're going to see that it can sort of be studied on its own or be found to kind of bleed into a lot of other areas of social psychology that we're going to be discussing. I hope you got a lot from this. If you need to, make sure you review. And hopefully I'll see you soon when we start talking about emotions in our next class. Take care all.